So our next panel, our penultimate panel, is reporters' perspectives. Beyond the notebook, reporters' perspectives on generative AI. Coverage of new technologies often runs the gamut from fearful to fawning, like the alliteration. How to develop an appropriate reportorial perspective on emerging technology and foster it in your team is going to be the sort of the focus of this. I'm personally thrilled because I've just been explaining there are at least everybody's a personal hero on this panel. I'm not going to introduce Margaret again. She is going to be moderating because sadly Kelly McBride had to get back to Florida before it's obliterated by the next storm or whatever, so she's not with us. But Margaret Sullivan is more than capable of moderating this panel. We also have Dave Lee, because we have to have a British person on every single panel, but that's not why he's here, who is Bloomberg Opinions US technology columnist, so he's the opinionated one on the panel. Really thrilled that we have Kashmir Hill, who writes about technology for the New York Times, been covering it for more than a decade, wrote an absolutely brilliant book, which I have I was going to say made my students read. I don't think that's the right phrase. Assigned to my students, which of you haven't read, which is Your Face Belongs to Us. That's right, isn't it? Yes, I haven't even got it written down. Which is not just a great procedural for reporting, but it also gives real insight into what's at stake at the moment in the current sort of data moment. And then Jason Koebler, I'm calling you Koebler, I think that's how, is that how you pronounce it? Koebler, I'm sorry. Well, and also it all sounds strange in my accent anyway, who is an absolute personal hero of mine because he is one of the founders of 404 Media. If you are not subscribers to 404 Media in this room and you're interested in these topics, you need to get yourselves a subscription because to my mind, not only are they a model of a newsroom that is set up in a small but incredibly mighty way, but if you're interested in this area, they are, I think, what one of our other panelists, Ben Smith, described as an absolute scoop machine, which is every day they have some insight or news story into this. So Jason is founder and editor there. Margaret, take it away. I'm going to get out your way.
So I would like Dave to sit here, Cash, and then Jason, because I like the audience to be able to follow you. It's slightly obsessive. Hello, is this on? Yes. Okay. Welcome to this panel, which is really about reporting on AI and how to make that better and what our panelists have learned about it. So I would like to start off with kind of a big general question, which is, what do you see as the state of reporting on AI right now? You know, sort of good, bad, indifferent, could be a lot better. You know, give us some sort of perspective on how you think we're doing in covering AI. So, Dave.
Can I take all of those?
Yes,
I think there's good reporting, there's bad reporting. I think some of the best reporting that we're seeing at the moment is taking one small element and diving in deep. And we mentioned some of the stuff that 404's been doing, and things like, asking the question of, okay, what's in the data? How are they getting the data? What does that mean? What's the integrity of it? Can we rely on it? I think that's useful. Where I think we drift too far on the other side of that is there's a lot of fear-mongering. There's a lot of overstating how good the technology is. There's a lot of things that land in my inbox that are, we've added AI to this, and you go, well, is that really AI, or are you just kind of saying that to get our attention? And I don't think that's particularly useful. But it's similar to when we overstate the chance of a recession or how bad Man United are doing or anything like that. We tend to go to the extremes, and we've done that with AI pretty quickly. And one of the things I think that has done is that it's given these companies even more value. There's this sort of level of, OpenAI is creating something that's going to be so potentially consequential to humanity. So imagine what it could do for your business. It gives it this sort of air of power and sophistication that I don't actually think it quite has yet. So I think with the AI reporting runs that entire sort of gamut.
Okay. Cash, how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, AI has been around for so long. So I guess the question is really about how are we doing on generative AI?
Yeah.
And it's amazing how new it still all is. I mean, it's been such a big news cycle, but it's really been less than 2 years since ChatGPT kind of broke it all open. And I generally think the reporting has been quite excellent. You know, I think that the technology journalism industry kind of learned its lesson around tech, around being too fawning about every single development. I think there's healthy skepticism. You know, I do see some fear-mongering, Dave, that you're talking about. But I've seen really good stories about, again, what's in the data. Like, I love that Atlantic story about which books are in the data, and there's this searchable tool for authors to find out if their work was in there. And just how generative AI is actually getting used in different industries. That's where I find it really compelling. Like, how well is it working? Is it fulfilling this promise that at least investors seem to have in it?
Jason?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think in the early days, like any technology reporting, there was so much that relied on like press releases and touting the potential of this thing. But I think that as journalists have learned how it works, we've started to see the limitations of it. And I think that as journalists themselves have started using it and started seeing how people are using it, I think the reporting has gotten a lot better. So I think we're in a pretty good spot.
So one question I have, and I guess for all of you really, is how you know, the audiences that come to this reporting have a very disparate amount of information about what you're writing about. So how do you write to an audience that can be quite sophisticated and quite knowledgeable, or kind of doesn't, you know, people who may not know much about this? You know, how do you avoid both dumbing it down and making it so obscure that people can't get it? How do you bridge that gap, and who do you think you're writing to?
I mean, in my case, I mean, the Bloomberg audience is, you know, business savvy, and as a result, you know, technology savvy, I guess more so than maybe a sort of broader audience possibly. So there's a kind of mixture in there, and I think the old rules apply, right? You don't assume too much knowledge. It's even if it feels like you're repeating yourself as a reporter, it sometimes is worth saying, here's what an LLM is each time you bring it up, or at least, you know, give some kind of guidance through a story. I just think it's important to to Kashmir's point about, are we talking about generative AI? I think that's also a very important thing to do. So this is precisely what this tool is for and how it was made, as opposed to just calling AI this singular sort of power that's been created in Silicon Valley. But no, I think, like I said, I think it's about the old rules and just bringing each story and just not coming in at a too high level, because people will tune out. And particularly on a topic like this, I don't think people can afford to tune out anymore. So yeah.
Interesting. And Cash, it seems like with writing in the New York Times, I mean, you have a very smart audience, but you don't necessarily have a tech savvy audience. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think usually the feedback I get from editors just assume that somebody reading this knows absolutely nothing about this. I mean, what I've been writing about more this year than generative AI is cars and privacy and data collection from cars, and you know, monitoring how people drive and giving that information to insurance companies. And so every time I write about it, you know, I have to explain smartphone apps that connect to a car. I mean, just like basic stuff that when I write it, I'm like, everybody knows that, you know, cars have apps and you can turn them on remotely and roll down the windows from afar and such. But every time I write a story, I have to explain it. And I think that's something we do with almost every technology story, is you have that graph that somebody who knows can skip, but somebody who doesn't appreciates for the context for the whole story to understand, what you're talking about and why it matters.
And do you find that's coming? Are you doing that now yourself, or are you finding that your editor will tell you or remind you to put it in? Or I mean, has it become Has it become sort of internalized or not?
That's why I really appreciate editors. Yeah, I don't know that I internalize it enough.
Yeah. Okay.
Isn't it
good.
the case that often the first person who doesn't understand the thing will be the editor, right? They are the sort of the informed, but maybe not totally across the story person that you come up against, and that's why it's such a useful process to have these layers before something goes out there. Yeah.
Yeah, we're a specialist publication, so our audience is usually very familiar with the technology we're writing about. But I think something that we've tried to do is to pick our audiences for different stories. So for example, I did an article about news sites as well as just like regular blogs blocking AI scraping in their robots.txt file. And that was an article that I thought that people in the AI industry and like journalists would read. And I did not think that it was for the general public. And so I didn't do as much like basic explaining in that story. Whereas we also try to explain like why the internet is the way that it is and why you start seeing spam like all over the place and where it's coming from. And for like my articles about Facebook AI spam, for example, I'm trying to pick out something that many people have seen and trying to explain how and why that's happening. And so for something like that, we're starting from like a level of knowledge where like we're gonna explain this to you from the get-go. Like here's what generative AI is, here's what these tools are, here's how they work, here's how they end up on Facebook, so on and so forth.
And is that because you think the audience for that story is going to be quite different?
Yeah, the audience for that is like your weird uncle. Whereas
how do you know that?
I just know. Like, I'm sorry to say that, but I think
it was
it's
going
just
to be a very
like,
specific tool.
I think it's because like when we're going into writing that story, we have seen something go very viral on social media, and we're like, okay, this is something that everyone is talking about, but they don't necessarily know where this is coming from. And so when we see something like a topic of conversation hit a critical mass like that, it's a situation where we're like, okay, people are asking questions about this, so we're going to try to explain it. Whereas if we're trying to explain why webmasters are blocking stabilities like AI bots, it's like this is not for everyone.
Yeah.
And I think that we've just gotten that sense over time and over doing this for
You get a
long
gut
time.
feeling for it.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd like to hear about how, very few children are born who say they want to grow up to be a reporter covering technology or more specifically AI. So I mean, how did each of you get into this, and was it a circuitous or a direct route, and how did it happen?
Well, mine was very sort of strange. My first ever printed piece was in The Guardian when I was a student.
Like a college student?
A college student, and I was in my first year, and I had a part-time job at Staples, and I was selling computers, and someone wrote a very sniffy letter to the paper saying how stupid the people selling computers were, and I was like, well, I'm on minimum wage, I'm just kind of getting by. So I wrote a piece about that, and it went into the Technology Guardian, and at that point on, I could call myself a technology journalist.
Absolutely.
who writes for The Guardian, So that was kind of the general way in. But I've always taken the view that technology journalism now is such a mainstream part of a news agenda that it almost doesn't need to be defined in a way. It's such a part of election coverage. It's a part of even like sports coverage. I mean, there's no area now where you couldn't say, well, that's a technology story. And I think that might be actually what, to your point about the coverage getting better, is that I think as it's become more central to newsrooms. There was a time when a tech reporter was the sort of the nerdy guys in the corner. Specifically nerdy guys in the corner. And then it just got much more interesting and much more consequential, and there was much greater demand for it, and it became much more of a respected specialism in the newsroom. So that was
I
tangent from
I like your origin story. That's great.
I think also there's more technology reporters in newsrooms now. So instead of jumping from covering Apple to covering Facebook to covering surveillance to covering privacy to covering whatever new app is out there, people are able to specialize more and become more of an expert in the things that they are covering, which I think is important, because when I started, I wrote about everything. Sorry to skip you, but we'll go back.
We'll come back.
Yeah. Like I was doing high school rankings for U.S. News and World Report, and they had a science section and needed to fill it, and they just asked the newsroom, like, does anyone here know anything about science or technology? And I was like, I went to like a science high school, I could try. And that's how like big publications cover technology at one point. And luckily I had spent a lot of time on like forums and Reddit and stuff. Like I was deep on the internet at that point, so I felt like I could get into it easier than, like I felt I could get into it, but I felt like technology reporting was something that a lot of people fell into, whereas now, as David said, it's like every reporter needs to have a base knowledge of it.
We're not going to say that people are computer-assisted reporters anymore. Right.
Well, all journalists
Everybody,
are. I mean, I
right?
feel like everybody's a technology journalist
Yeah,
now
yeah.
because technology is just so layered in all parts of society that everyone's doing tech stories.
So what's your origin story?
My
on
origin
this?
story is a little circuitous. I was a legal blogger. I was on this legal blog called Above the Law, and so I was mostly reading about legal news. It was kind of Gawker for the legal industry, and then I went to journalism school at the other one south of here. And I took a class where I was supposed to develop a niche that I worked on for a year. And I was deciding between, I'd come up with two ideas. One was mating and dating, which was about like dating sites and genetics, which I was really interested in. And the other was the not so private parts. That was about how privacy was changing. This was 2008. Like how was privacy changing because of the rise of social media sites and smartphones. And my professor there, Rob Boynton, said you should do that one. And so I just started writing privacy stories, and it forced me to get to know cookies and Google and Facebook and how our data, was being used and processed. And so I kind of backed into, all of a sudden people started putting me on lists of like 10 technology reporters you should follow on Twitter. And I didn't realize I was a technology reporter until that kind of happened.
That very moment.
So I really backed into it.
Interesting.
Just as a sign of how far things have come, the BBC for a short time had someone whose title was Internet Correspondent.
Internet correspondent.
And when the guy was given that title, there was outrage in the newsroom of people saying, "Can you believe they just got a guy and all he's covering is the internet?"
That's
It
great.
seems absurd
What a
now.
niche! What a niche beat. One of the things we've been talking about at the conference, generally, or it's come up, is how important diversity is in informing what kind of comes out through AI. And so I guess I'm wondering whether you think there's any kind of imbalance in who covers AI, who covers the technology beat. Is it a diverse crowd, and does that matter? When you look at your organizations, I mean, does it tend to be, the next generation of the nerdy guy who was in the corner, or is it pretty diverse, and does that make a difference? Should it change?
I mean, it's still a challenge, isn't it? I mean, I think you can tell there's been change when you go out as a technology journalist and you just sort of see who's around you at events and who's covering and so forth. But it's still obviously not where it could be. I think another thing that's encouraging, and Bloomberg does this, and when I was at the BBC and at the FT, there was schemes to do this, but a lot of the challenge isn't just in sort of having diverse journalists, but also the people they go to for comment and input need to be, as diverse, if not much more diverse. And so having these kind of hard targets of making sure that half of people that get on air at Bloomberg should be women, and then breaking it down even further into different.
Is there a
groups.
guideline or a rule like that?
I don't want to misstate what it is because I don't quite know what the exact target is, but I do know that we, even in the building, we have a chart on the huge screen they have up and above the sort of canteen area at Bloomberg that talks about these targets with progress. And at the FT, it certainly was, and there was a thing in the CMS where you'd have to say this is these are the people we've spoken to. So I think that sort of stuff can often be sort of scoffed at initially because it feels almost like tokenistic. But actually, when you are in the reporting process and you think, oh, hold on, I'm going to have to account for this, it does make a difference. At least that's how I've sort of felt about it when I've been doing that.
Interesting. And Cash, could you address? I mean, both on the who's doing the reporting and who are we reporting on?
Yeah, I mean, I think diversity is important in both. I mean, actually, it makes me think of not exactly journalism, but just importance of diversity. You know, I wrote this book about facial recognition technology, and if you know nothing else about facial recognition technology, you've probably heard that it's biased and it doesn't work as well in some faces as other faces. And what was interesting to me when I was looking into the history of the technology is that people had known this going back to 2000, 2001. I talked to this one early facial recognition company that told me they deployed the technology in South Africa and it just failed, and so they just canceled the project, but it didn't lead them to try to fix the problem. And it really wasn't until some researchers of color like Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru brought attention to the problem that it really started to get fixed. And so I do think diversity really matters because apparently for a long time within the industry, they're just ignoring the fact that there were these problems there. So in terms of whether we're there yet, I mean, I do think that the tech core is could be more diverse.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important for all the reasons that Kashmir said. I think it's just the facial recognition diversity issue, the fact that facial recognition often can't recognize the faces of black men, and people have been arrested falsely for this. Just, it's critical. It's really important.
And you're saying that is, so that makes it matter.
I'm just saying we're writing about technology that is biased, and I think that you need a diverse set of voices, sources, and people who are impacted by this.
And what about those doing the reporting? Does that matter or not?
Yeah, I think it helps if you have a diverse newsroom and people who can speak to different experiences and people who can credibly write about this technology from a variety of different perspectives. I don't think it's critical that every single story, like, I think editors can get into a situation where they only want trans people writing about trans issues or only want black people writing about black issues, and I think that can be very important, and it's if the reporter wants to do that kind of work. But I think that there's also the risk of pigeonholing reporters and saying, well, you're a black reporter, you need to write about black issues or bias against black people. I think that is a trap that some people can fall into. And so I think it's critical to have a diverse newsroom, but also have the entire newsroom be aware and cognizant of these problems and these biases and be able to cover them credibly. But I don't think that we're there yet, but I think that people are at least cognizant of this at this point, and we're like taking steps in the right direction.
Yeah. So I'd like to turn to some questions that Kelly McBride had prepared that I thought were interesting, and they have to do with AI stunts. So Dave, start us off. What is an AI stunt?
See, this is a topic I get a real bee in my bonnet about this.
Okay.
Because it's basically I describe an AI stunt from a journalistic point of view as a new tool comes out, a new model comes out, and a very good and quick way to do a fun story that will be very well read. It will come up on the Tonight Show, is to put something ridiculous into an AI prompt, and then the AI will spit out the ridiculous thing. So,
That's the story, right?
And that's the story. And look, there are pieces of those stories that are interesting. So there was one, I think it was something like, someone had made a picture that it was Elmo flying into the Twin Towers, right? A ridiculous picture, and an offensive thought. But the way that the AI did that was because someone sat there and said, "Make me a picture of Elmo." So it's like, well, it's like the joke of, I went to the doctor and I said every time I raise my arm it hurts, and you go, well, stop raising it then, right? It's
stop asking these dumb questions.
Yeah, and also I think what it leads to is companies spending a lot of time before something gets released thinking, okay, well, what's the journalist gotcha going to be, and how do we deal with that, rather than attacking the more deep-seated issues of where are the sort of the critical biases in the system, and where is the real capacity for abuse that's beyond just a juvenile joke. Now, look, there is some merit in some of this stuff, because you might think, well, if it's able to recreate Elmo, then that means Elmo, and that material is in the data set, and that's an interesting question to think about, and particularly when it comes to brand protection and all this sort of stuff. But I think sometimes I get frustrated when a lot of the attention and discussion about AI is on this very sort of frivolous top layer.
Have you ever done a story like that?
I don't think so. I mean, I may have tweeted a thing, like I managed to get to do this.
That's different.
But I think it is different. And now I'm wondering if I have done that.
That's all right. I haven't been through. I haven't been through your.
What's a specific story that you hated of that sort?
Well, the Elmo into the World Trade Center was one, and people did it with SpongeBob, and because also what I think it also opens the door to is when tech companies overcompensate for that, it also opens the door to what we saw recently, where you had the kind of people against the woke thing sort of saying, oh, isn't it ridiculous when you put this in, it only shows you black people, what about the white people? And tech companies have a tendency to sort of stop the stunts by overcompensating and leaving the door open to even more sort of ridiculous headlines from the other side, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think that type of story, we did that SpongeBob story, SpongeBob into 9/11. It's fine. I don't take offense to it. I think that there's an important discussion to have there. The reason that we sometimes do these stories, like we sometimes do that, and then we more often do deeper reporting on AI. But we did do SpongeBob is piloting a plane into the World Trade Center, and a lot of people did click it, and that was nice. But that's not why we did the story. We did the story because I think when these new models or these new technologies come out, that's the first thing, not that just journalists do, but that 4chan does, that like the people who are making non-consensual porn on Telegram do. When you have like generative AI of Taylor Swift on Twitter, like the communities of people who are doing that are the same people who are like making SpongeBob fly into the World Trade Center. Like they're looking for these vulnerabilities, and once they find one, it goes very viral. And so I do agree that some of it's very surface level, but I think a lot of the harms that we've seen with generative AI come from these like really silly oversights where the AI won't generate Taylor Swift if you type Taylor Swift, but if you type like blonde, whatever, if you type like singer of the Red album, like it will generate her. I need to be more creative with how I would prompt Taylor Swift, but trust me, like people are finding ways to get these tools to generate things that they shouldn't be, and I don't think it's necessarily our role to be like the cops of these tools. But at the same time, I think that a lot of the harms come from like very low-hanging fruit that people are exploiting. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think all the reporting should be like that, but I think that there's space for it sometimes.
Yeah. Cash, do you see a role for a demonstration kind of story as opposed to what we're talking about as a stunt? And is there a role for that? Is there a role for that in the august New York Times?
I mean, I love stunts. I'm like the queen of stunts.
Yeah.
I've lived on Bitcoin. I stalked my husband with AirTags, all for stories. I switched to a flip phone for a month. But this specific kind of AI stunts of, how did the systems react to a particular query? I mean, I actually do think that, they can be kind of frivolous sometimes, but understanding how these systems break is important, I think, just for the companies as well as the users. I guess a kind of stunt that we did last year at the Times is I can't remember how the story came up. I did it with my colleague Nico, who covers Google, but we noticed that when Google first released its image labeling software back in 2015, and it would go through all your photos, and you could search it and find bicycles or the beach, and it would bring up various photos. And for one user, it labeled photos of him and a friend as gorillas. It was a very famous story. They were black, and Google said, we're so sorry this happened. We're going to fix this. And the way they fixed this is they turned off the gorilla label, so you couldn't search for that anymore, and other primates as well. And so Nico and I discovered that it was still the case a decade later, that they haven't fixed this. And it was kind of amazing because there's been so many advances in technology and computer vision in the decades since, and we were just trying to figure out like why is this still broken? And I do think it's important to pay attention to those places where, yeah, it seems like the tech companies can't or won't fix it for some reason, where they kind of wall off a part of the technology and just move on. Because then I wonder, how many of, in the scaffolding that is tech infrastructure, how many pieces are like this where this part just doesn't work? So yes, I think they can be useful if done, not too often. I hope that's not every story. And I'm a subscriber to 404, as you all should be. It's a great publication, and that's not what all of your stories are, certainly.
No.
I think what's kind of curious about the 404 example is that, funnily enough, because Kelly, who was going to moderate, she mentioned she might bring up this topic, and I thought of the thing, and I actually on the subway here I googled it to make sure it wasn't one of your stories, because I was worried that I could look like I was slagging you off, right? But I think this kind of points to an interesting thing. What I found was the sort of derivative reporting from your story, which I guess that's what happened, that rather than talk to the deeper issues that you would have gone into in your piece, just picked on the ludicrous bit of that. So that maybe that's the sort of the missing piece here, isn't it? It's like it's attaching the stunt, if we call it that, to responsible reporting, which is obviously what you guys are doing. So maybe that's where the picture
stunt.
gets
that
mixed
actually
up,
brings me to a stunt that we did that.
We could just talk stunts.
Well, no,
that's
Someone's going to crack through the window in a minute.
This is why you weren't able to find our story, though, is because since we're a new publication, we're not indexed by Google very often, and we're not showing up in Google News very often. But we have found that a lot of AI-generated content farms are on Google News. And so one thing that we did was we went on Fiverr and we asked someone, there was a guy in India who was willing to make you a content farm powered by generative AI. And we paid him $150 and he scraped our website and used generative AI to make like slight variations of our stories, which the reason we did this was because this was naturally happening to many of our articles. And those articles on these AI-generated content farms were showing up in Google News, but ours weren't. And the reason that was happening is because you can have a generative AI write 200, 300, 400 articles a day, and we're writing one article a day, but Google is taking those 400 articles and saying, oh, this is a very active news site, and it's indexing it. And so that's the type of stunt where I think, I call it a stunt, but I think it's more of a we're using the technology to see how it's working and also to explain why this phenomenon exists. So I'm glad you brought that up, but that's probably why you couldn't find it. And I also don't know if we were the first people to write about SpongeBob in the World Trade Center, but I think it was a lot of people writing about it that day.
All right. So as someone, myself, who has gone back and forth between editing and writing, I'm always curious to know, when an editor always, upset with the reporter, and as a writer, always upset with the editor. So I wonder if you could tell me what's the most helpful editing you've ever received, and what's the least helpful. You don't have to name names. But what kind of editing is helpful? What has been helpful?
That's a big question. I think for me personally, so I have so for the last year, since I've been at Bloomberg, I've been an opinion columnist, as opposed to a reporter, which is you know yourself very well, it's a very different muscle to flex in a newsroom, and the editing is very different because, when I had my news stories edited, particularly at the FT, where they have a long culture of what an FT story looks like and sounds like, I would file a story and it would come back FTIs, there'd be paragraphs gone, there'd be new ones in there, and the first few months I was doing the job, I thought, I am terrible at this, because nothing I file is coming out the other end looking like my stuff, right? But
you got a chance to look at it and change it?
Yes.
Look at it?
Yeah, there was it's a process. Yes. And what I found interesting about news reporting is that the primary goal of a news report is just to get the information on the page. The actual sort of writing of it sometimes that's a collaborative effort. It's the facts and the new bits of stuff that you've got. Opinion writing is very, very different. When someone edits my opinion, it's much harder to take, I think, because you're sort of saying, well, no, I wanted to say it like this, and I wanted to have that nuance and all that. There's a very famous incident with The Guardian and Giles Corran a few years ago, where he wrote this scathing email to an editor about how they changed 2 words in his column and how it ruined it for him and all that sort of stuff. So that's it. But to answer your question, I think sort of the best editing I've been lucky enough to have done to my work has always been sort of just consistent but mindful of voice for a column, right? As long as the voice is still in there, the voice I think I've
You're
put across.
not making this point clearly enough.
Yeah, but editing that's within the style of how I want to sound. Whereas as a news reporter, I felt that was less important, because it is. Yeah.
Okay. Cash?
Most helpful editing, I love an editor where we sit, after they've kind of done the big idea editing, when we sit down and we're just kind of going line by line together and looking at anything extraneous we can cut. I just love a tight story that has no extra words. In investigative reporting, when I was working on the Clearview AI story about this startup, it was very mysterious when I was first working on it, that scraped billions of photos from the web to make a facial recognition app. The company did not want to talk to me, and they'd kind of hidden who was behind it. And with my editor, we kind of went through all my reporting and figured out which doors I hadn't knocked on yet, that I could literally go and knock on doors, and it kind of broke open the story for me. And so that's so helpful to me, kind of showing me, helping me figure out which path I haven't taken in my reporting. In terms of not helpful editing, both too much or not enough. So hate, that feeling of early in my career, when I was working at magazine, and it would just be, wow, this is a different story than I wrote. Seems weird that your byline is not also on the story. Or somebody that just doesn't do enough, so it's not. I like the CYA of editing and making sure that I'm not going to get in trouble when the story comes out because I missed something obvious.
Do you find with investigation stuff the editor that's able to say, no, keep going? Because we're in that sort of trough of this isn't going how I thought it was going to go, this isn't maybe the story I thought it was going to be, but having someone come in and say, okay, what you've got here is great and you should carry on doing this and get over the doubt bit of that process. Yeah,
definitely. That's, it was really helpful. The Clearview story comes to mind where it was I could have written a version of the story at that point, but he's I think you can get more. And we came up with ideas about how.
I'll start with the bad, and I think it's if you have multiple editors in a hierarchy and they are beefing with each other and they are diametrically opposed, I think that putting a writer in a position where one editor is editing out a bunch of stuff that was already in there, and then the second editor is saying, why didn't you do this, or why didn't you cover that? And it happens way more often than anyone would think. I think you're doing a disservice to the writer if the editors can't get on the same page about what the story should be. I think multiple sets of eyes is always much appreciated and different perspectives appreciated, but if the editors fundamentally don't agree with about what the story is, and that then falls back on the writer, I think you can end up having a writer who has to do way more work than they should. And I find that this happens most often with freelancers. I think freelancers often get in this situation where they file a story and then weeks go by and they're just kind of playing this game of tennis with their editors, where it's just going back and forth, and no one can agree what the story is. In terms of good editing, I think I'll talk a little bit about beat selection and story selection. I think asking your reporters to cover what they're passionate about is very important. I worked at Vice, and then I worked at a company that I co-own, and so I've had a lot of freedom in my career, which I really like. One thing we did well at Vice, I think, was finding out what people were very interested and passionate about and having them chase those stories. And it really came through in their work versus saying, we really need a transportation reporter, and then just taking someone and putting them on that beat. And I think when you do that, the story selection is often very kind of basic, and people don't dive deep into the communities that they're covering in the way that they should.
How are the editors eliciting that passion, I'm just literally
So when
asking
I was editor-in-chief of Motherboard over at Vice, and when I was hiring for a reporter, it was very rare that I ever said, like, I want a surveillance reporter or I want a business reporter. It was, we just want a reporter, and we had people come in, and I was like, what are you interested in? Like, what's the most interesting thing that's happening on the internet right now? Like, what forums are you on? What websites do you use? And if people didn't have a good answer, like, we didn't hire them. But we ended up hiring two of the best, like, tech labor reporters, and they were like the unionization of big tech, for example, and like labor abuses at Amazon and things like that. And the people who we hired for those positions, like, walked in the door and they were like, I'm really, like, very passionate about what's happening at Amazon right now, like the conditions at the warehouse, the working conditions of the delivery drivers and things like that. And we didn't go into that looking to hire someone to do that. We just wanted someone to do good stories because, we had a small team, and so we weren't comprehensive. We weren't covering everything. But ultimately, because they were so passionate about that, they were constantly getting scoops. They were constantly getting news sources. They were constantly going to events and finding events and things to go to and things to report on. And I think that kind of the worst situation is having someone who is stuck on a beat that they don't know much about or they don't have much interest in. I think that can be, like, it can kill careers, honestly.
And make for deadly stories.
Yeah, very boring stories.
Yeah, boring stories. So one of the things we've been talking about a little bit throughout the course of the day is transparency. And there was a bit of a challenge and a kind of a contrarian point of view expressed, which I thought was really interesting, about maybe we're going a little overboard on transparency when we tell the reader, So, the question is, how much should we be telling the reader about the use of AI in our journalism? And is there a risk of, going too far by labeling everything, by attaching explanations to everything? Where do we draw the line on that? Is it important, or is it increasingly less important because there's so much more of it? What are your thoughts?
I think it's really important, yeah. And I think as we're journalists, but we're readers of other places, right? And I think as a reader of another publication,
you want to know.
I want to know, yeah. So that should apply to my work as well. I guess where it gets difficult is what constitutes made with AI, right? And we've seen Meta has had this issue, and I did a column about this where there was a photographer who got up at the crack of dawn to go hiking into a national park and got this beautiful sunrise picture, and like many landscape photographers do, he kind of blended 4 images to get the nicest light and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things he did was use Photoshop's generative AI tool to remove like a lens flare, I think it was. And then when he uploaded that onto Threads and Instagram, because there's metadata from Photoshop saying this used AI, it gets labeled made with AI in the same way as if he'd just gone onto their tool and said, do me a nice sunrise, right? So obviously there's a difference. There's a huge difference. And I think the difficulty in being transparent is we have to really spell out what it means, right? This is a story that maybe used AI to do some image, maybe it looked at 10,000 documents and helped us whittle down into a few. That's very different to saying we just give it the stuff and put it through ChatGPT and here's the article, right? But I absolutely think wherever AI is being used in the newsroom, I think it helps our credibility to be as open about that as possible.
I guess I'd love to have everybody answer this, Cash.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's, I guess the question is how much should we disclose all technology that we use? And yeah, it just seems like there's a difference between using generative AI, maybe if you create some model where you're putting in a bunch of information, like in the last panel I was talking about the hacked emails from Sony, and then you're using it to query that database as opposed to writing it. And I think any kind of AI generated material, I think we want to know, just because of the flaws with AI, that we can judge it accordingly. I was thinking about this a lot because I was reading an article yesterday that my colleague did in the Times about how doctors now, some of the communication platforms they use are starting to incorporate generative AI to automatically create drafts in responses to questions they get from patients, because they're overwhelmed after the pandemic. Since so much medical care moved to digital platforms, it's way easier for patients to reach out to their doctors, and they just don't have enough time to respond to all the messages. But their current policy is not to say that it's been generated with AI. I think because on the other end of that, when people see that generated by AI, I think that we discount the information. We really want humans to be creating things. Human effort matters to us. So
I'm not really sure I want my medical answers coming from AI, and so.
And they said, don't worry, 2/3 of the time the doctor opens the draft and edits it. And I was like, what about the other third?
Those are okay.
But yeah, I think at least right now, I think that we're all kind of deeply uncomfortable with AI generation, unless it's so clear that you're on ChatGPT, this is AI generated information. When it's kind of getting laundered through humans, it starts to make us feel uncomfortable. So I think it should be disclosed. At the same time, when you do disclose, it's going to make people maybe not want it.
It's something we do for trust, but it makes people less trusting.
I think about it every time when on New York Times articles, we have this reporter reads program. Well, they'll have the reporter read their own story, and they layer in all this extra stuff, sometimes sounds from the reporting. They talk about why they did the story. And so whenever I see play on an article, I often want to listen to it. But as soon as we also have like an artificial voice that will read the story. And as soon as I hear that, I'm like, I'm out. Because I
Only the
care.
real thing.
Yeah, I want the human version.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think the specifics matter. I think it's like, is the reporter writing every word of that story? I think if they're not, I think that's very bad. I think it's very bad if they're using generative AI to write portions of stories. And we've seen a lot of, let's say, financially distressed websites starting to use generative AI and launder it through either avatars of people who don't exist or real reporters, and just starting to up their output quotas. And so, the ethics of these places are not that high to begin with, but I absolutely think that that sort of AI should be fought against, frankly. I don't think that there's much of a role for it in the newsroom. I don't think there's much of a role for it on the internet. And I think that any use of AI in the newsroom should probably be driven by the reporters or someone in a technical position, like a research role or a technologist in the newsroom, versus from the executives. I think that when a publication starts using generative AI and using it to either replace jobs or increase the quotas, I think it should be disclosed, but I don't take that publication seriously at that point. I think that there are uses for AI that I can imagine having, especially combing huge data sets, as has already been talked about a little bit. I think that a lot of people do use things like Otter and transcription softwares and translation software, of course. But for example, for some of my reporting, I did a lot of Google Translate during the reporting process when I was writing about people in India who were generating Facebook spam, and all these YouTube videos were in Hindi. And I used Google Translate to find the portions of the videos that I wanted to use, but then I had a human completely review and translate it for us. And I think I did end up explaining that in the article, and I don't know if that was necessary or not, but I always favor more transparency, I think.
Yeah. So we're going to go to audience questions soon, but before that, I'd like to ask each of you kind of a dual question. What's your favorite AI-related story that you've done, or column? And what is an example of one you didn't do that made you wish you had done it, or made you feel a little jealous? You can go last.
I need a minute to think about
Yes, that's fine.
I can
Okay.
go. So my reporting on Facebook spam, I got completely obsessed with Shrimp Jesus and all of these just massively viral images on Facebook that were just being recommended by the algorithm over and over and over again. I think I wrote 5 or 6 stories about this, and it was something that seemed kind of frivolous at the time, like when I started, but by the end of it, I was like, this is an incredibly crazy industry of spammers that are making lots and lots of money from Facebook. And I was like proud of how I was able to figure out what was going on there.
And you got a lot of response.
Yeah, people like those stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I did like 7 podcasts about it, something like that. And then I've been very jealous of Kate Nibbs's reporting at Wired on like sites like The Hairpin and like formerly beloved blogs being taken over by content farms. And she talked to, I forget which website it was, but I think it was The Hairpin, but it was like a guy in Estonia or Romania who had bought The Hairpin and replaced it with an AI content farm, and she like did a really great interview with him about how he did it, why he was doing it, and that sort of stuff. And I was very jealous of it.
That's worth the jealousy. Okay, coming back in this direction, Cash.
My favorite AI story. So it's not generative AI, but it was about kind of AI used for enforcement, which was about the way that the technology platforms now have AI tools to find inappropriate images of children. And sometimes they're doing that by using a hash of like known images that are kind of circulating. But Google had developed a tool that can recognize novel, kind of basically child pornography, and flag it, and they'll shut down someone's account and they'll report them to the police. And I did reporting that found that people were getting flagged for inappropriate images, but they were inappropriate images of like their children that they'd taken for doctors during the pandemic, and they took it with an Android, so it auto uploaded to the cloud, which to Google register as sharing, and these people got reported to the police. They lost their Google archives. And after I did the initial stories, I started hearing from more parents like, yeah, my kid went on YouTube and did like a naked dance because they thought it was funny, and now I've lost my wedding photos and every email I've ever sent. And so it was just about how, I mean, so often we think about this AI, and it's funny, like I think we as people have this we have two things in our mind at the same time, that the AI is super flawed, but that it can be perfect. And I thought about this a lot during the kind of content moderation days, when we would be doing all these things about how AI was flawed, but then people would be like, but Facebook just needs like one perfect algorithm that can get rid of all this horrible stuff and political misinformation. Just the fact that we think things can be perfect and flawed at the same time. And then jealous of AI, I think I mentioned it before, but I love that Atlantic story that was demonstrating all of these works that had been sucked up into the training. And then I also loved, was it in the Wall Street Journal? It was about generative AI within this high school and how it was getting used by teenagers to create like deep fake porn, and just the effect it was having on these high schoolers. And I just thought it was a really powerful story and showing how this is really playing out for human beings, which is always my favorite kind of tech story.
So one of the things I've been, and sadly it's not quite as fun as Shrimp Jesus and things like that, which was awesome reported by the way. That was the AI slop problem is just, it's so fascinating. But I've become obsessed with just trying to pressure these companies to have to be more open about their data sets. And I think it's the lowest hanging fruit of all AI regulation that we could possibly have. Tell us what is in it. Right. Before we even talk about,
tell us what you base this on.
What data's in it, because then people can get paid. And we can make judgments on So some of my early writing on that, I was quite pleased with. My regret was not going harder with it, and perhaps following that. One of the pieces though that I did love, that I was jealous of, and I think this is talking about the sort of human side of this. There was a great piece in the Atlantic about AI not being able to make art, right? And I think this question of, every time I feel like every time I load Threads, there'll be some video and someone will say, well, Hollywood's dead. And it will be some guy like gazing into the camera, walking along. I think, is it? I mean, I probably don't think it is. But one of the things I want to write more about, certainly, is this idea that one of the defenses against generative AI, particularly in writing and film, is taste, right? There's something to be said for the quality of something that's innovative from a human thought perspective, as opposed to just the technology. So that piece about why AI can't create art, I thought was plenty of people disagreed with it out there in terms of what its conclusions were. But I just thought it was such a great thought-provoking way to get at this.
Yeah.
Because then the ultimate question then is, what is art, right? So then I find that side of this debate endlessly fascinating.
Great. Thank you all very much. Great stuff. And I'd like to throw it open to the audience now. We have some pretty cool people up here. So what would you like to ask them? Yes. I have to, but I couldn't see you. But now I see you. So.
Sure. Hi, my question's about sourcing. I'm Jermel from the Tau Center. My question's about sourcing. When ChatGPT first came out, I think we saw, we made some kind of obvious mistakes as journalists, the over anthropomorphization of the coverage. I think we talked to a lot of computer scientists who are experts in how the system is built, but not necessarily experts on like how it's going to impact society later on. You mentioned a few names earlier. There's some people that we mentioned the godfather of AI a lot. Jeffrey Hinton got a lot of mentions. And I think a lot of that culminated in like members of Congress talking about regulating ChatGPT like they regulate nuclear weapons, because that's there are these ideas of dooming and all this stuff that kind of got a little mainstream because we paid a lot of attention to it. What I'm wondering is, the conference is navigating what's next. I feel like we've kind of passed that era a little bit. And I'm curious to hear in this next sort of round of reporting on these tools, what are y'all seeing in terms of sourcing? So who are we talking to? Who are we not talking to? Who should we be talking to more? Who should we be talking to less? And sort of, if a reporter is coming to an AI story, not as a seasoned tech journalist, how should they think about sourcing?
I think the next big story is going to be what comes next for OpenAI and these big large language models, because I think that they've been promised as these like tools that are going to replace a lot of human labor, and I think that they're falling short. Like, I think that companies that are using them are finding that they're spending a lot of money spinning them up and that they're not delivering on their promise. And I think that all of these are propped up by VC capital, of course, and I think that they're burning through cash and they're running out of things to train on. And so the big question is like, are they going to get better? And I don't know if they're going to get, I think that they're going to get better, but are they going to get good enough to where they're going to be a threat to mankind? Like, I don't think that we're going to get there at all, but are they going to get good enough to do anyone's job? And so I think that talking to workers who have been displaced, talking to managers who fired all of their workers and what it was like after those workers left. I know that there's some companies that are having to rehire a lot of roles that they laid off, thinking that they could automate them away. And then I think also talking to the amazing academics who have been doing research in this space for a long time, but the people who are saying like, what's the next like big step change that's going to fundamentally change how generative AI works? Because I do think large language models are running out of like human data to suck up. There's only so much out there, and I think that the New York Times like lawsuit is a huge deal. Like, if OpenAI loses that, like, what happens then? So that's what I see.
Yeah, if I knew who we should be talking to more, then I would be talking to them. So I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that question. But I do think that Jason's right that we're in the point now with the technology where the question is, how is it doing in the specific use cases where it's getting rolled out. And there's a lot of reporting to be done then, because everybody is trying to apply this technology. Like I was talking about the doctors, that's being inserted into the doctor-patient relationship. So I think seeing how it's going and then also revealing where it's happening that people don't realize. And I do think there's this feeling right now of deception when you're interacting with a bot and you don't know it. That's very uncomfortable, but it is very possible to do that to people now. So trying to uncover that. And then, on the data sourcing, it's funny because I feel like every time I talk to a generative AI kind of startup now, and I'll ask them, okay, well, what's your data? What are you training on? And it is like deer in the headlights eyes, and they just start giving an answer that's totally unrelated because they don't want to talk about what their source is of data. And so that's going to, I think, continue to be, how are you sourcing this, ethical data sourcing, and what that looks like. And again, it seems like it's going to be really different here versus Europe in terms of what's allowable.
I think, I agree. I think 2025 is going to maybe be this sort of proof in the pudding year for AI, right? And I had a meeting recently with a voice AI company, and they're working with White Castle, the takeout, whatever restaurant you call it, to add AI to their drive-ins, and they've been trialing this. I think it was like 50 locations or something up and down the country, and you kind of go, okay, well, I can sort of see where that would work, but does it work? And the people you want to talk to there aren't at the corporate level. They are, the 17-year-old that is running the drive-through on a Friday night to earn some college money. Like practically, what is it doing, and does it work? We are starting to see a lot of what were murmurs become a lot louder about just how much this is all going to cost, right? You've got OpenAI on the verge, it seems, of completing a $6.5 billion funding round, which will be the biggest VC round ever. And that, to me, still feels like a drop in the bucket for what they're going to need to actually fulfill their goal. And we had Sam Altman posted on his blog the other day that artificial general intelligence was a few thousand days away, which, where do you even begin with that? It's like a sort of Elon Musk prediction of, what does that mean? But even he, in between those lines, I urge you to read the blog post, but he kept on saying deep learning's worked, it's worked. Almost like he was trying to reassure himself, right, that he'd backed the right technology, because there are people out there who think there is a ceiling to this. And I think this is what you were getting at, Jason. There's a ceiling to, does stuffing these machines with data, does it just mean it's going to get smarter and smarter and smarter until it's perfect? I don't think that's a conclusion we can make right now, particularly when in the hunt for more data, these companies are talking about creating synthetic data, and now they're being fed with data that itself was generated by AI, particularly a lot of academic papers that we're seeing that have trademarks of AI all over them. So I think that's going to be the fun story, and where it, for someone who works for a business publication, what does it mean if we start to see a pattern of companies that tried AI and gave up, right? What does it mean if, when Mark Zuckerberg says we're going to up our capex this much, but what we're doing is over-allocating just in case. We don't want to be left out if it works. But if it doesn't work, we've got too much, so what? And then they'll pull back. What does that mean for a company like NVIDIA when they do pull back, right? Given that NVIDIA is now something crazy like 10% of the entire S&P 500, right? Which is just absurd. And it's all on this basis that what they're creating is going to work. And I don't think that's necessarily a cut and dry thing. So that's what 2025 feels like to me from a reporting perspective.
Emily?
I actually had two questions, but that's one too many. But what I was going to ask, I think you've partly covered, which is what's undercovered. So in other words, there's a huge area of stories. Without giving away all the scoops that you're going to get, what's undercovered. And then the second one was, how are you finding access to the companies and the executives? Because that's always been, speaking as a former business reporter in this area, really difficult. I think that we talk about access to data, but access to people is just as important. And it feels as though I'd be interested to see whether or not we feel that that relationship is changing as well for reporters.
Anybody jump in? What is that? I think that access question is really, really interesting. How are you finding that to be?
I'm going to answer the undercovered very quickly. I think the energy use of AI is undercovered, and I think that's because AI is complicated and climate reporting is very, very difficult. And so finding people who understand both, very hard. Like I don't touch it because I don't know. It's like it's a whole specialty, and I think that there's very few people who are looking at it, and it's critically important.
I'll talk about the access question. It's never been my strength as a reporter, kind of like access to companies. I've always kind of reported around them because I'm so often reporting on users' experiences. But it has been surprising to me, like with OpenAI, I was talking to some users of the tech early on when it first started analyzing images, and somebody mentioned to me, they said, oh, you know what's weird is they blur faces, like it can't talk about faces. And I was like, oh, that's really odd. And he's like, yeah, I think they accidentally built a facial recognition machine and they don't want to disclose it. And so I reached out to OpenAI and I said, you know, hey, early beta testers are telling me that the software can't see faces. And they're like, yeah, we kind of inadvertently built like a facial recognition machine that doesn't work that well. Like it mostly identifies famous people, but also we're worried about what it's going to say about people's faces. And so, yeah, to this day, they just blur faces when you upload them to like ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini. But I was surprised by how OpenAI was about talking about it. Because I think when I first started covering technology, like a decade earlier, I think Facebook would have avoided, you know, a kind of question in that realm as much as they could. But OpenAI is like, hey, let me put you on a call with a researcher here, and we can talk about that and how we're handling it and what we're worried about. And so I found that very interesting about the company. And I should also disclose, yes, Jason mentioned it, but the New York Times does have a lawsuit against OpenAI. And whenever I talk about them, I am supposed to disclose that.
I think we know that.
I mean, access is interesting because from previously when I was a beat reporter at the Financial Times, access came thick and fast, right? Because they want to give you the CFO for a chat or the CEO for a chat, and so that can like go into your, particularly around earnings and all that sort of stuff. As a columnist, it gets very, very different because all of a sudden they're not so bothered about that generally. So it's kind of, yeah, in my role it's changed. But I think access and tech stories, they've got very good at making sure that's always on their own terms, really, in a lot of cases. Unless, to use your example, you sort of catch them at something and then come at it from like, oh, we've got this, and then they think, oh, well, if there's going to be a story about that, we want to be involved. That's kind of earned access, right? But in terms of some of the other access, it's very much strategic on their part, and it doesn't it doesn't really matter kind of what you do to change that. They'll always kind of have their approach to that. I think with undercovered stuff, and there has been some great reporting on this, and but I think there could still be more. It's just the labour underpinning AI. One of my favourite stories that I did for the BBC a number of years back was going to Nairobi and visiting the facilities where people were tagging images so that they could be fed into Google's self-driving projects and some other stuff as well. And I think the Times had a thing about, is it Scale AI? I think it was yesterday. That was similar thing, really, really interesting. And there's this enormous human labour force that's doing all the grunt work for AI, and because the companies don't want you to think of this as a mechanical process, they want you to think of it as a magical product. They often don't really talk about that side of the work, and what it means is that these people responsible for making these great tools are underpaid and work in sometimes what we'd think would be poor conditions and all that. So I'd like to see more coverage of or at least sort of continuingly good coverage on that.
Good. Yes, right. Well, wherever the mic is closest. But let's go over here. Yes. Hang on 1 second while the mic is coming right behind you.
Sorry, yeah. So for something like the Elmo example, if you want to pull out themes about how the models are interpreting queries, as a reporter, do you have to jump to somebody who's super well versed in statistical analysis and has studied the models at length, or are there tools or research frameworks where someone could conceivably pull out takeaways for themselves?
I think you just ask ChatGPT to generate Elmo, like in many different ways, and then when it generates that, you can reasonably infer that Elmo is part of the training data. But Cash has already mentioned this story, but the Atlantic's books story was so good because it revealed all of these books that ChatGPT had been trained on or OpenAI had trained on. And I think that so much of what we know about these large language models are based on sort of like attacking and reverse engineering little bits and bobs of information based on whether you can make the system reveal something about itself. So that anytime there's like an actual leak from within some of these companies about what they're training on, or actual like good reporting where you can see that data, it's really important.
Over here.
Thank you. I'm Lindsay Christ from Spectrum News. I was wondering how you use AI in your personal lives or work lives, but as journalists who are trying to either make policy around this or cover it, I find myself trying to force myself to use it so I understand it better. So in my case, I work in standards. I'm making policy, but I don't feel like I should be making policy if I'm not using it. So I'm always curious how you are actually finding yourself using it.
Great question.
Yeah, I definitely force myself to play around with it as much as possible. When it comes to facial recognition technology, I did a story about one of the search engines that's online called PimEyes, and asked any of my colleagues who would send me photos of themselves, especially hard ones, like where they had a COVID mask on or glasses, if I could run it and see what came up. And it was just, it was amazing how well it worked. And it was one of these stories that kind of dispel people who didn't think facial recognition can work quite well with a high resolution image. So I do try to like test the systems out. With generative AI, I mean, I just haven't yet found it super helpful with a project. I haven't had like a big kind of data sweep I've needed to do with it. I'd be interested to do that when the chance comes up. My favorite AI tool right now is whenever I have to do a presentation, which I didn't have to for this with PowerPoint, just using like their AI designer tool, and it like makes a slide look nice because that's not a skill that I have. I'm a text person, not a visual person. So that's the AI tool I use the most.
I don't think I've got a personal use case other than just like mucking around in WhatsApp group chats and doing the generation there. Work-wise, I think it's a really interesting moment because there are sort of good discussions around when can an AI tool be really useful for a reporter, right? And I think one interesting one is something like Grammarly, which is, in my experience, a pretty competent editor of text, and it does a fairly good job of sort of straightening out some sentences that could be clearer and all that sort of stuff. Not as good as a human editor at all, but it is an interesting sort of thought. It's like, does that count as using AI? I mean, I guess maybe. I mean, is spell check AI? No. So like, where does the line go? But the most useful by far thing that I think professionally is I use Notion, a note-taking app, to save stories when I just go around the web, and I have a little bookmark thing, and whenever I save a story into my Notion thing, it scans that story and it pulls out tags and people and events, right? So if there's a news story saying, here's a thing and it's going to launch on September the 20th, then the AI will make a little button that says I can just tap that and it will add September the 20th to my calendar and say this thing's happening on September 20th. Now, for a columnist who, compared to being in a normal newsroom of reporters that work sort of in a pack almost, when you're a columnist, you're kind of, I don't know how you feel about being a columnist, but I feel quite isolated. I feel like my work is my own, right? And my research is my own as well. And you don't have this network of people reminding you that stuff is going on and invites coming in, all that kind of stuff. So having Notion do some of that hard work for me when I'm reading so much is great. And so that just that alone, like categorizing what I'm reading and when things are coming up, like that's a real time saver, yeah.
I don't really use it in my personal life at all. In my reporting, I think a lot of my uses are very incidental because well, first of all, I'm using a lot for my reporting. Like, I'm using these tools for specific stories to see how they work, and I'm like watching a lot of YouTube tutorials about how to make a fake influencer on Instagram or something like that. And then I'm like, how does this work? And then I'll recreate that and see that it works and see those sorts of things. But I think that in our newsroom, which is just our Slack distributed, we're incidentally using AI in a lot of different ways. But I don't think people think about it as AI necessarily. It's like we use Riverside to record our podcast, for example, and it will auto-transcribe, and then it will automatically create different clips and things like that. And that used to be a job that took me a very, very, very long time if I wanted to transcribe my own interviews, for example, or if I wanted to edit a podcast, it took a really long time. And now you can get like a passable version of a chat podcast in like 5 minutes after finishing recording. I think like Adobe Audition has various like AI tools in it now, and I think that that layer of where AI is integrated into software, but you don't necessarily know it, or you don't think of it as AI necessarily. I mean, it has been the case for 20 years already, but it's like every tool we're using now has some level of machine learning or AI in it. But especially like the transcription, translation, podcast production, stuff like that, video editing, I've found that I'm using some of those tools without realizing that there's like AI in it now.
Good. I think we have time for one more question, if there is one out there. And if not, thank you so much to a great panel. This was wonderful and much appreciated.